The idea that the games industry globally has a footprint probably the size of a country like Sweden was just on no one's kind of radar. My best guess is that it's somewhere in the tens of millions of tons. The disclosures that I've added up over the last couple of years from the biggest game companies in the world point to a figure somewhere around about 20 to 50 million tons per annum.
Hello everyone, welcome to Green IO. I'm Gael Duez, and in this podcast we empower responsible technologists to build a greener digital world, one byte at a time. Twice a month, on a Tuesday, our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. And because accessible and transparent information is in the DNA of Green IO, all the references mentioned in this episode, as well as a full transcript, will be in the show notes. You can find these notes on your favorite podcast platform and, of course, on our website, greenio.tech. I'm all in mushrooms at the moment. This is how a few months ago, Giovanni Celeste started to describe his new game. He kept on. They're incredible, and you can tell great stories with them. Of course, to be more mainstream, the first part of my new game is about bees. But I'll do scenes with mushrooms. Giovanni is a pillar of the small but vibrant gaming sector in Réunion Island, where I live. He crafts games focusing on the ecological transition. He works either with a small team or by himself. He's what is called an indie developer. Before our discussions, I hadn't realized how diverse and complex the gaming industry was. For me, it was mostly massive studios delivering entertainment to more than 3 billion of gamers worldwide. Our discussions reactivated a question I had in the back of my mind for some time. How is the gaming industry doing with its environmental footprint? With massive data transfers, billions of devices sold, and all of the computing power used to develop and run the games, it cannot be negligible. Thomas Bofis from the Tales from the Tech newsletter pointed out to me several signs showing a modest interest in the sector, starting with very few C-level officers exclusively in charge of sustainability in the main studios. Sure, here and there some initiatives are emerging, such as a petition against developing games in the metaverse, the ongoing work of the French agency ADEME on a referential for sustainable gaming, or Whatwise, the active game jam on the energy consumption of video games. Still, most of the buzz is about the gaming industry helping to raise awareness on climate change and ecological transition, almost nothing about its own footprint. This is where Giovanni told me about the Sustainable Gaming Alliance. And voila, I eventually found experts to discuss the gaming industry environmental footprint. Maria Wagner and Dr. Benjamin Abram, respectively the SGA Managing Director and SGA Research and Standard Lead, kindly agreed to answer my questions about the footprint and, more importantly, the tech worker in the game industry sector should do about it. Ben has written an entire book on the topic, Digital Games After Climate Change, based on his PhD work. Maria's personal story could be the scenario for a video game. Before becoming a seasoned actor in the gaming industry, she worked in diplomacy, intercultural conflict management, as a political observer in Syria, or run a refugee camp. Whoa, the perfect fit to run a global multi-stakeholders initiative to green a $455 billion market. So, welcome Ben, welcome Maria. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Gail.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
You're welcome. Just to understand a bit the context before deep diving into the environmental footprint of the gaming industry and the many different topics that I'd like to cover with you. What makes the gaming industry so specific within the tech industry? And how come that we usually don't incorporate in the big green software, green IT, sustainable IT, you name it, momentum, which is happening around the world, what is related to the gaming industry itself? And as I said in my introduction, the gaming industry is pretty big, both in terms of a number of gamers, employees, and workers. So I guess in terms of footprint as well. Maya, you're a very knowledgeable person of this industry. Could you maybe try to give us an answer?
Yeah, I think the games industry is very special when it comes to the connection to the people and, of course, also the reach, right? As you have said, we are reaching basically half of the globe. And this is something which a lot of people forget, that we are the medium of the times. So compared to movies and films or the TV, there is no other medium which reaches so many people. And I think this makes us really special.
So it's a question of reach, according to you, more than the technical setup behind it.
The technical setup behind it, of course, as well, I would say it's way more complicated because it connects so many different parts when it comes to games. There are so many parts which need to come together to make a game happen. And this is maybe something also Ben can cover perfectly because he looks into the value chain.
The thing that separates the game industry from just general software and tech, to my mind, is that it is a software industry, but it's also an art form. It's an art industry. So it's both artistic practitioners who work with digital tools. So there's like 3D artists, but there's also coders, there's also community managers. There's a really strong emphasis on engagement with the end users. Games companies are very aware of what their users are interested in and care about. And so it is just a software company. Games are just a software development exercise, but they are also an artistic exercise as well. There's a creative dimension to it.
Which make them pretty specific, I would say, because I've never heard about a piece of SAP reporting being branded as arty. What about its environmental footprint? We're talking about billions of users. We're talking about hundreds of millions of devices worldwide. So I guess it's pretty big. I couldn't really see any global report on the environmental footprint of the gaming industry. So maybe that's an issue that we should discuss a bit later in the episode. But what are the numbers or the order of magnitude that you could share with us to grasp how much is the gaming industry impacting the planet?
So in terms of orders of magnitude, I think that's the right question to ask because we really only have a rough sense. It is in the tens of millions, almost certainly. Is it less than 100 million? Possibly. When I started the research work that became the book that I wrote, Digital Games After Climate Change, there was hardly any kind of research out there. I couldn't find anyone who was even really thinking about what the impact globally of the games industry was, in terms of emissions at any rate. There was a bit of awareness of things like e-waste, of resource consumption, and that vaguely there's this thing called the cloud that's probably not great for the environment. But the idea that the games industry globally has a footprint probably the size of a country like Sweden was just on no one's kind of radar. And so my best guess is that it's somewhere in the tens of millions of tons. The disclosures that I've added up over the last couple of years from the biggest game companies in the world point to a figure somewhere around about 20 to 50 million tons per annum. And that's just playing games. That's players, that's infrastructure, making the games themselves, offices, it's everything. The complexity of it is, it really does sprawl.
And Ben, you're mentioning to greenhouse gas emissions when you're talking about millions. That was the main focus of your study in terms of environmental impact. Am I right here?
It was, yeah. So I tried to break down the production process into different phases and looked at what is involved in each phase. So developing games, it's a lot of power in offices, it's IT purchases, new equipment. Distributing games involves data centers, the digital distribution networks of Steam, the Apple Store, the Google Play Store, all these devices that are getting, games downloaded to them. And then the end users themselves, and the devices that they play games on, whether that's a games console or a PC or a smartphone. And each one of them has vastly different levers of decarbonization potential, and vastly different levels of transparency even in terms of what we know about each phase.
And did you manage to calculate also the embedded carbon, or was it only carbon emitted by the energy consumption, or also the carbon emitted during the manufacturing and extraction phase, so through the entire life cycle of all the devices?
So I did also look at embodied carbon, and I also actually looked at a little bit of the other non-climate environmental impacts, so things from like mining, rare earth materials, and things like that. So I actually, in my book, there's a really interesting table, like I call it the periodic table of torture, where I go through a list of elements that were detected via this advanced ICP-MS method of analyzing what are the atomic elements inside a PS4 chip. And I go, okay, well, what are they probably doing in there? Where do they come from? What are they used for? Are they part of the transistors? Are they part of some other part of the lithography process? Yeah. And so when it comes to games consoles, at least, companies like Microsoft and Sony have gotten a bit better over the years at disclosing what the embodied carbon is in those consoles. So we know a little bit about them, but PCs, because there's so many device manufacturers, there's so many different hardware components. Yeah, again, that's just this big question mark unknown area.
That's interesting because you mentioned embedded carbon, so everything related to greenhouse gas emissions, but you also touched upon the material footprint, which is how much we need to extract to get one piece of console or chip to be manufactured. When I facilitate digital collage workshop, that's a figure we use a lot, which is basically for a 300 grams smartphones, we need to extract around 70 kilos of resources. So that this ecological backpack is pretty big. Do you know if this is this same order of magnitude for a console, or can it be a bit smaller?
It's a really hard question to answer. My suspicions are that they're about the same. I don't have any hard numbers exactly. So my study was done on the smell of an oily rag. I had no money to do it, and my research lab couldn't actually tell me the exact quantities that are in them. It's a good guess that most games consoles are probably equivalent to like a smartphone.
Okay, well, so that's pretty big. It's a ratio in terms of hundreds times more than the actual weight of the device. Okay, pretty good. Maria, are there other environmental impacts that the gaming industry is starting to get aware of?
I mean, at the moment, we are in the phase of raising awareness in general when it comes to the footprint of the value chain and really producing games, because I think there is a big focus when it comes to the reach and what people can communicate through their games when it comes to getting their own house in order and looking at the value chain and decarbonizing the value chain itself. There we still have a long way to go.
I think I'm going to hire you to explain to everyone why this podcast is about cleaning our house rather than doing green tech or tech saving the world. That's right. That's exactly the approach I've got. Okay, so before deep diving into the industry and more specifically a tech worker in the gaming industry can do, I've got one question. So as a gamer in my personal life, are there some things that I should specifically focus on to reduce my environmental footprint? Maybe Maria, do you have some idea?
You can look at your electricity grid. So where do you get your electricity from is a huge factor. And of course, you also have to ask yourself if you always have to have the newest hardware which is out there, or if it's possible to play your favorite game maybe on like an older device. Yeah, so I think this is something what players can do for sure. And of course, being more vocal about it. Ask your favorite game studios about their footprint and responsibility. And the same goes, of course, also for the hardware.
Regarding the devices, what is the churn rate? I mean, smartphones used to be crazy. Like the average use span of a smartphone used to be a year and a half. So people were literally dropping perfectly functionable devices to get the newest one. It gets a bit better since a few years. I think it's a bit above 2 years, which is completely insane when you think about all the energy and materials and resources put into this incredibly sophisticated device. But anyway, heard that the gaming industry or the console, people tend to use them a bit longer. So how much the device is something that we as gamers should also focus on, or how much is it more about energy consumption, as you mentioned a bit before?
I mean, this is a question, or this is a topic we actually discussed. I think just like last week. Of course, it takes up a lot of resources to produce new hardware. So I think we should, in general, question our culture of having software which always needs new devices. So basically adapting the software in a way that we can still use the old devices and it still would run perfectly. So it's hard to say, because of course if we would use hardware way longer, then it would be more an energy question and optimizing the software to use less energy. But as long as we keep pushing the boundaries and need always new hardware, this is still a big question.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit extra context or a little bit extra color there then. The games industry has been basically since the 1980s, it's relied on selling games or marketing games via a kind of approach that sells based on graphics, right? Like this, it's slowed down a little bit in the last 5 to 10 years. But for the longest time, it was like, it went from 8-bit graphics to 16-bit to 32, and then you get polygon counts, resolutions, frame rates. And so that's been kind of embedded in the games industry for a really, really long time now. The expectation is we're going to sell games by saying, oh, this year's model is better. There's more polygons, or it's, it goes up to 200 frames per second, or it's more responsive, or it's got this new engine or that new feature. And that drives the hardware upgrade cycle. So even though console generations, so if we're just talking about console gaming, last for somewhere between 6, 7, maybe 8 years at the very most, in terms of like, a new one comes along and it's upgraded and better. Usually what ends up happening is we get these mid-cycle refreshes where, you get the PS4 Pro or the PS5 Pro or, these upgraded ones. Yeah, so basically the games industry has been locked into the hardware upgrade cycle for a really, really long time. And we're really, really reaching the limit of that. In the last year or so, the games industry has been through a real shakeup. It's been through a real crisis. It's because production costs of making games has been so high because of this churn of graphics and visual fidelity that just means you need to throw more and more artists at the problem, more and more 3D modelers, more and more texture and all of this sort of stuff. And that's to sell more consoles, to sell more games. And that's part of this unsustainable trajectory that we really need to rein in.
And Ben, it's super interesting because I remember that when I used to read magazine, yes, paper magazine, on games, the best way to praise a game was it's beautiful. It's an interesting choice of word, like it's a beautiful game. And it was, as you said, a lot based on graphic and not necessarily how enjoyable it was to play with this game. We could have expected a journalist wanting to praise a game, saying, oh, it's incredibly gameable or enjoyable to play with, or it got many twists, or you get completely hooked by the story. That's true that most of the time it's all about how beautiful, how well crafted, how pixel perfect the game is. I think it has started to change a bit with in the industry, but yeah, it was really something that struck my mind when you mentioned it, this vicious cycle of always more hardware. So basically, to wrap up what you both said, for a gamer, it's really about questioning the need for the latest shining stuff and considering keeping the hardware longer and make sure that the electricity grid is as decarbonized as possible, especially, I guess, if the person plays a lot via streaming solutions. Am I right to summarize it that way?
I maybe would also just add there are so many beautiful games out there which don't have like the craziest, newest like graphic and the craziest needs when it comes to hardware. And this is something which we need to cherish. And I think it's just like, as you said before, a marketing question that especially like the big corporations is on the shiniest versions and like the games which need a lot of resources, but there are also games out there which are completely the opposite and are beautiful as well.
Just to add on to that as well, like I think one of the things that I want to emphasize too is that this is what we know at the moment, right? Like, so the ability for consumers to actually affect their, end emissions when they're playing games is actually, it's quite limited, right? Like a lot of the power it's in the choices that have already been made by people upstream, by big corporations, by big companies. But there will be things that consumers can do, and that's sort of what I think needs to kind of happen, and what we're hoping to do with the SGA actually is to get the whole of the industry, consumers, producers, fans, even people who hate the games industry, all to be on the same page about, okay, where do the biggest interventions need to happen? Where do we get the most bang for our buck?
Ben, what a wonderful transition. Let's talk about the gaming industry itself. So maybe it's time to talk a bit of, first of all, as a worker in the IT industry, in the gaming industry, how much am I exposed to the fact that I'm also part of the problem and I emit greenhouse gases and I consume a lot of non-renewable resources, etc., etc.? What is the level of awareness in the gaming industry at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the question which, like, one of the other co-founders, Jiri Kupiainen, and I was asking ourselves when we did our 10 weeks to save the games industry tour, where we really wanted to interview the leaders of the industry and just find out what is their knowledge level on this topic. So, like, we interviewed around 40 industry leaders within 25 cities and found out that they don't know anything about it. A lot of people think that because games are digital, that they are automatically green, or that they say, okay, compared to other industries, we don't have such a huge footprint, so we don't need to focus on that, which is, of course, crazy because we don't have any data.
The level of awareness seems to be very, very low, even compared to other sub-part of the IT industry. I mean, usually it's in the cloud, so it doesn't pollute anymore. It's something a bit of the past now in the IT industry. That was something that you could hear maybe 5 years ago, but not that much today. So you mentioned the Sustainable Gaming Alliance, and I guess you created the SGA as a reaction when you realized with Yuri and other people that the level of awareness was super low. Could you tell us a bit more about this organization? Why you created it, and how is it helping to contribute today to a greener, if I may use the word, gaming industry?
Yeah, so basically, before founding the Sustainable Games Alliance, like, I, for my part, was leading the Games Forest Club, another NGO, and was helping games companies to donate to forest protection. And there I realized, like, very fast that a lot of companies use the forest protection or planting trees as a way to, think of themselves that they've done their part and being green. But the problem is, of course, that they never looked at themselves and at the value chain. So they did not understand that they need to decarbonize and need to, really basically change their way they're doing business to be sustainable. So in the conversation which we were having together, like with Yiri, we found out that we need numbers. We basically need numbers to be able to address this topic. There are no comparable numbers at the moment. At the moment, every company can just publish and say whatever they basically want, what their current footprint is. And this is something we want to address, because only with comparable numbers, we will be able to talk about best practices and how to optimize and more efficiently reduce the footprint and decarbonize the industry.
Maria, there is something that I don't understand. Most of these companies, they are pretty big. They should already report carbon audit. I mean, especially if they're European based, or even in some states in the US, you've got now compulsory carbon reporting following GSG protocol or other protocol in France. So how come that the numbers are not comparable?
It's because these reports are based on the greenhouse gas protocol so far. I mean, there is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, which is based on the ESRS. But the problem is it's not game specific. So basically, when you do your reporting, the framework and methodology is so vague, it leaves so much room for you to make decisions and adapt your numbers that in the end, you get non-comparable results. Because, for example, up until now, companies could leave out category 11, the use of the product. And it's like in gaming, a huge part of the emissions. If companies leave this out, the numbers are not comparable.
Yeah. The reason I think that a lot of that happens is that, again, because games, the games industry relies on these larger tech platforms. Like there's not a lot of direct to consumer sales of games, right? It all goes through either Steam or the App Store, or that's about it, really. There's no buying a game directly from the producer usually. There's like a platform between you. And so what that's meant is that most of the companies have been like, well, I didn't design the Xbox. I didn't design the PlayStation. So that energy profile is like outside of my control. So I guess they just decide, and this is like open to them based on the interpretation of the greenhouse gas protocol, that, use of sold products, that's not my responsibility. It's actually the console owner's responsibility. So like Microsoft's or Sony's responsibility. It ends up with this situation where there are large parts of the games industry that are, number one, just not being added up. They're not being calculated properly. And then number two, we have no plan for how to reduce them, no real actionable strategy for how to get to net zero in the games industry.
There is no, in the SBTA framework, any specific guidelines for the gaming industry. Not at all.
I don't believe so, no.
And could you share another example? Is there any discrepancies or way of calculating that creates so uncomparable reports?
Well, I think a lot of it just comes down to it not being a practice for lots of games companies, right? Yes, it is quite surprising that a lot of the big companies aren't disclosing. That is changing over time, but quite a lot of the biggest game companies, if you think about like Nintendo, based in Japan doesn't yet have a mandatory reporting standard. Nintendo actually does disclose quite a bit, but there are lots of other Japanese games companies, South Korean games companies, North American games companies as well that it's just hasn't been on their radar. No one, I guess, has really asked them to do this reporting yet.
Maybe like one more thing is so the problem is there are so many different components within the value chain. I think this is something which is like really special, that the greenhouse gas protocol does not provide the boundaries between the different service providers. So we have, for example, ads, right? Like if you have a mobile game and it's free to play and you have like all the ads which are played during the gameplay, there is no clear definition of who's responsible for the emissions of these ads which are played during your game. And this is just like one example of how many different companies are involved within the value chain. And because the boundaries are so unclear, you have completely uncomparable numbers.
And the same goes too for game engine makers. So most modern games are made on a software platform. They're made in Unity or they're made in Unreal. And so there you go. You're like, okay, well, I don't have control over Unity. I don't have control over Unreal. Is it really my responsibility to do something about the efficiency of my software? Or what are the levers that I even have, right? It's not visible within any of them yet. You know, what you're actually asking of your end user and their energy consumption. You know, and this could be millions of people that you're potentially selling and playing your game.
That's a beautiful example, Ben, because I've done a bit of research and actually there is a search solutions named Godot. And that's a bit insane. Without any piece of data, I think it's something like 60 gigabytes of data just to install Unreal. And then you've got this other game engine called Godot, and it's 160 megabytes. So it's just insane, the difference. So it seems that for a developer working in the game industry or a small studio, there are some leeway. Or am I completely misunderstanding the issue here, Ben?
No, I think that's right. It's hard to know exactly because it's just never been part of the culture to really think about the performance. I mean, it has been for specific platforms. Like you need to hit your target. You know, maybe the new Call of Duty will have a frames per second target of 60 frames per second on, this specific kind of hardware thing. And so they will always like push the limit right up to their, squeeze in as many pixels and stuff as you can. But yeah, there are absolutely alternatives that use less space, less power, less like resource intensive, less taxing on the player's device. And, if you just take a different artistic approach, take a different game development methodology, basically, you develop something smaller, you're not making a big blockbuster hit. If you're an indie developer and you're working in a small team, you don't need all the features of Unreal. You're not going to need them all.
I mean, I think this is also like the exciting part of our work, that because it's so new to the industry, there are so many low-hanging fruits and potential, because like people just have not looked into this topic much. And yeah, that's the exciting part about it.
But how easy do you believe the change in mindset will be?
I mean, it's partly mindset, but it's also partly the business model that the games industry has used and relied on to sell games. So that approach to marketing the game as being, the newest, biggest, freshest, most advanced game, and selling a new game every couple of years, right? And you're moving on to the next project. As soon as your game is out, at least until fairly recently, when with the advent of games as a service, a lot of the games, they would just get shipped and then you start the next project immediately. So there's nothing really to optimize, or there's no chance even to optimize in the development cycle for saving money in the servers, unless you are running a game like Fortnite or something with big servers. And then, that's, I think, where it's probably starting to happen.
And where things are starting to move, because you mentioned several times the business models, but we talk more and more about streaming game. We can also see that maybe a fraction, I don't know how big it is, but of the gaming industry is focusing or refocusing on the narrative, the beauty of the story and the beauty of the gameplay rather than the beauty of the game itself. So are these trends potent or are they still marginal? And what is changing in the industry that could positively impact the reduction of its environmental footprint?
I think actually that the industry is getting more mature at the moment because of the problems it has been through or is still in. I think before, the eyes were also not on the industry that much. So there has been this discussion within the industry, are games political or not? Do we have a responsibility as game developers to be political? And I think it also goes into, do we have a responsibility to decarbonize, or is this up for our service providers and the politicians to deal with that topic? And I think at the moment, there is a change, that the industry is getting more and more mature and is ready to take on more responsibility, just because we have, on the one hand, the regulation, and also politics are getting more and more interested in games and what is going on the platforms. Yeah, I think also the society is now a little bit more aware that the games industry is a huge industry, and before they were able to just be something on the side and be not heard of.
It's the number one media today, maybe with video streaming, but I'm not even sure. I think video gaming is bigger than video streaming. And just to bounce back on what you said, I've never heard about a single cultural product which is not political per se. By not willing to be political, it is political. It means that it's just conservative. And I guess if you look at the story of Call of Duty, it's just a living recruitment ad for the U.S. Army, and it has been copycat by almost all the armies around the world for recruiting purpose. So it is very political what you put in the game. So let's play a game, pun intended. Let's say that we are a team of a small indie studio, because big corporation, it's a different story. And we are, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 people in the room. And we are brainstorming and we saying, okay, what are the top 3 things that we should consider changing or we should consider start doing to truly make our games sustainable? According to you, what would be the 3 things that a small indie studio should consider?
Certainly, I think the top one is to support older hardware, because that's the big challenge, right? That like a lot of the games industry, we have the solutions, we just need to kind of implement them. So we can buy renewable electricity, and we can run our servers on renewable electricity, do digital downloads renewably as well. But when it comes to hardware, that's just always going to have a huge emissions and huge other environmental footprint attached. Doing things to opt out of the hardware upgrade cycle to make devices last longer, I think is the number one thing for a small team to do.
I actually would agree when it comes to that. And my number 2 would be get in touch with other studios who are already working on that topic, because like I still think that at the moment the industry is barely connected when it comes to sustainability and games. And there are a lot of great examples out there. And of course, yeah, like talk to us, because we can provide you with the tools to measure your impact.
You mentioned several times the framework, or actually the tools that the SDA can provide to anyone in the gaming industry to help get better measurement or calculation. You want to say something about it?
Thanks, Gail. At the SGA, our main mission is to produce a methodological standard for how we measure, how we collect the data, and how we calculate the end greenhouse gas burden of making games, of playing games, of selling, distributing games, the whole value chain. We're working on this standard, and it's going to be an open source standard. It's going to be open to anyone to use and apply. And we want as much input as possible. Like, we're already consulting with lots of games companies. The goal of it really is to just save everyone a whole bunch of time, right?
Is it more a tool or a methodology or a framework? Is it like plug and play? That's my first question. You just drop numbers from, I don't know, your accounting system or wherever you need those numbers from? Or is it more something that you get your own people trained to understand how to apply this methodology into your company? That will be my question number 1. And my question number 2, because they might be a bit related, is how connected is this work that you're doing with the GHG protocol or other protocol or meta way of measuring the footprint?
So it is a little hard to describe, because it is a work in progress. We obviously have massive, big vision for it. We want it to be like the kind of plug and play thing. You can just like connect it up to all your existing systems. But at the moment, it's just a set of methodologies and some spreadsheets that I've made to kind of, test the methodologies and work as a tool for people who maybe don't have anything to use at the moment.
I mean, basically, our goal is to help the games companies to comply with CSRD. So the methodology sits on the baseline of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the ESRS. So it is basically helping the games companies to understand all this blurry line which the Greenhouse Gas Protocol leaves open at the moment. So what we're doing with this at the moment spreadsheets and supportive numbers is that we reduce the time and effort of the companies to doing the research themselves, and also to be alone making this decisions which are going into the reporting. For example, what is material for my studio? This is something which you cannot put into a spreadsheet or a calculation. This is something which you need to decide case by case. And what we are doing is we helping the industry to have this conversation and decide basically what is material and what is not. So they're not alone. At the moment, this legislation is still a moving target. So it would be stupid to now develop like a tool, right? Because it would be outdated in 2 months. So it's kind of a moving target, and we are offering a community with experts discussing all these topics. So like this poor reporting sustainability managers are not alone having to make these decisions, but that they can basically connect with each other, exchange knowledge, and in that sense, save themselves time and share best practices.
Okay, so I've got a better understanding of what is currently offered by the Sustainable Gaming Alliance and the big vision, I would say. So thanks a lot, both of you. I think we have some sort of an action plan now with the brainstorming exercise plus the explanations you provided with the SGA methodology.
And when it comes to the story, I wanted to add on that, like a little bit. Of course, it always depends on what kind of game you're developing. But sometimes the stories within games are very focused on extraction of goods. I think game developers should just but I think most of the game developers do just be more aware of like what kind of story do you convey to your players. Like, does it always have to be gather everything and throw it away afterwards? Like, does it need to be like this extraction? Because there are more and more games which are keeping that in mind, that there is always a cost to extraction. But this is something which is like quite new, I would say.
Yeah, we should create an extension to Age of Empire, where actually when you ran out of mine, it's not like stable, because it happens, I was always very shocked when I used to play with this game that, okay, it's over. We collected everything on the map and it's over. And you stay at the same level of civilization, and it should be like an immediate drop back to a prehistorical age. Like, you don't have the gold to pay, whatever, or the resources. So boom, end of game, end of civilization. But I got your point that the philosophy of being a bit more aware of how our biosphere works, and that it's not just extract, and then the game is over, because actually in the real world, we don't want the game to be over. Ben, you want to add another action?
It's probably a little bit less relevant for small indie studios, but it's still something they can do. And it's actually something that the Microsoft Xbox sustainability team pioneered. So what they realized is that there is a lot of waste in games, a lot of wasted energy. When players are sitting on a menu screen because they're in between rounds, or they've gone off to make a cup of tea or get some food or whatever, you don't need to be pushing all those pixels on a idle state, right? And they worked with a couple of different studios, big studios, small studios, and they realized that, if you just shave a few frames per second off the menu screen and you lower the resolution, you can save like a substantial amount of power from that device while it's in that state. And I think the result for Epic Games, who make Fortnite, was in the order of like megawatt hours of power a day just from this one change. So if you've got a really big audience, you can make like a big impact.
And that's pretty amazing, because it's user-aware electricity consumption. Like, if no one is actually using the game, no need to consume crazy amount of energy, if I follow you right here.
Yep.
But Could we envision a world when we move a step forward with carbon aware? Like if I know that my electricity green is highly carbonized at the moment because of the time of the day or because where I am, I will offer my user to maybe play with a lower quality or, resolution being a bit degraded? Or is it something that at least at the R&D stage, like not being rolled out already, is something considered, or it's a bit of a taboo, like all the time, best services ever should be delivered to our user?
I think it's possible. It's definitely achievable. I think the barriers there are actually just cultural. It is like, oh, we've always got to have the most beautiful image, and we are starting to see attitudes in gamers change. A bit of research done in 2021, I think, asked gamers, 1,000 gamers in the US, like a whole bunch of climate and sustainability related questions. And even then, a majority of them said, yeah, the games industry has a responsibility to reduce its emissions. So I think players are starting to be aware of this, and it's at the point where we just need to connect those desires with the solutions that developers already have.
I'm just like thinking, but wasn't the eco mode version like the Fortnite event what they did? I mean, it was playing with reduced frame rate as far as I know.
Yeah.
But there was no study done how the players received it, right?
Yeah, I'm not aware of. I can't remember what was in the white paper. They have a published white paper that you can go look at and see. But I think the goal mainly there was to be as unobtrusive as possible. It's really not a thing yet in the games industry to connect with those gamers that do have those green impulses and make use of them.
Also, like, sorry to add on that, I definitely think that there is the potential, and for like an indie game studio, in that sense, I would say the number one thing would be to get together with others and put pressure on the big service providers, the platforms, or not pressure, but like working with them together to decarbonize the whole industry. Because I think if we see the big picture and we have comparable numbers, it will be way easier to decarbonize as a whole industry than one studio doing little tweaks.
Before closing the podcast, I know that you've already shared some resources, but is there any other resources on top of the SGA and your book, Ben, that you'd like to share that could be very, very useful for a tech worker in the gaming industry?
I think at the moment we are also shooting a bunch of different interviews with industry experts. And I think it's actually interesting to hear what is happening there. So this is definitely something I encourage people to look into, because we are interviewing, the different sustainability managers with their challenges and solutions within the industry. We are really coming from the industry, and the solutions we design are for the game developers, like really for people working at the games, and which will be applicable. Like Jiri Kupiainen, who is one of the founders and had like won the ideas, is an engineer himself. He had a bunch of like companies within the industry. Also, Petri Järviletto is one of the co-founders of Remedy, who is backing us, and of course also David Helgason, the founder of Unity. So we are backed by industry experts.
So thanks a lot for these extra resources and extra explanations on what you're trying to achieve with the SGA. Now, traditionally, and this time I will make no exception, I love to close the podcast with positive note. So I would like to ask both of you, what is the positive piece of news that you would like to share regarding sustainability and maybe even sustainability in the gaming industry?
Well, yeah, so I was really encouraged by the recent publication in, I think it was a Nature journal, looking at the effect of what we might consider the more extreme climate protesters was on public sentiment. I think they ran a study on the public opinion after, like before and after the Just Stop Oil intervention that I think threw some soup on the on one of those artistic works. And the result was actually that rather than like harming the cause or anything, actually the support for more moderate climate sustainability action rose after those sort of extreme interventions. So I thought that was really encouraging. It just made me want to like go out and do the Andreas Malm thing and blow up a pipeline.
I think it's very encouraging to see that more and more companies are reporting on their Scope 3 emissions because, of course, on the one hand, they have to anyway because of the European regulations. But it's encouraging to see that also a lot of companies doing that like out of free will, and that we get more and more data within the market. And because of that, it is also more and more clear that we need to have more refined methodologies and that we are basically all connected. Because I think many times we think we can sweep over the responsibility to someone else. But when it comes to solving climate change or decarbonizing the industry, it's really about working together. And I think seeing more and more companies disclosing their Scope 3 emissions is something which will help to recognize.
So transparency and working together. I think that could be the tagline of this episode.
Actually.
So thanks a lot, both of you, for joining the show. I think I will very carefully consider which kind of device I will buy to put under the Christmas tree. As I said in the introduction, that's a sector I absolutely have no clue on how it works. So I learned a lot thanks to both of you. So once again, it was great to have you on the show. And I hope that we will keep on having a very interesting discussion.
Thanks, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail.
Good time.
Thank you for listening to this Green.io episode. If you enjoyed it, share it and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We are an independent media relying solely on you to get more listeners. Sharing this episode on social media or directly with a colleague or a relative working in the tech industry is also highly efficient to switch more responsible technologists in action mode. In our next episode, we will welcome Annie Freeman, who's based in New Zealand. Full disclosure, I'm completely biased with this country. And we will deep dive into a concrete use case, the building of an internal product in a company to calculate carbon emissions of each software component of each team using data from Climatic. Stay tuned. By the way, Green.io is a podcast and much more. So visit greenio.tech to subscribe to our free monthly newsletter, read the latest articles on our blog, and check the conferences we organize across the globe. Paris is in less than 3 weeks from now, on December 3rd, 4th, and 5th. You can still get a free ticket using the voucher Green.io VIP. Just make sure to have one before the remaining 30 free tickets are all gone. I'm looking forward to meeting you there to help you, fellow responsible technologists, build a greener digital world.
One byte at a time.